Hello Internet, welcome to the channel. My name is Frankie, and in today's episode, the penultimate episode of Little Asia, we're going to be building a habitat for the sun bears. So for this habitat I had a rough idea of what I wanted to do, and it is loosely inspired by the sun bear habitat at Chester Zoo here in the UK. What I started out by doing was creating an L-shaped kind of building where one part of the building is going to be accessible by the staff. I mean, it's going to look like it's accessible by everybody, but I'm going to lay a staff path underneath it so that only staff will go up this one side. And then there'll be a door on that side that allows them access to the actual habitat. And then the rest of the building will be a kind of contained viewing gallery that at this stage I didn't plan to have be much more. But as you can see, I'm making it quite wide, and once I'm finished, it feels a little bit lost, so I end up filling it up with a few more juicy bits and bobs. In terms of the roofing for this particular building, I keep it fairly simple and just do one large gable intersecting with a slightly smaller one. Luckily, when you kind of merge two tile pieces together, they actually fit together quite nicely. Inside, like underneath the roof, it's not going to look the nicest, so you might need to mask it later on if you want, using other building materials. But from the outside, it looks completely fine. And once all of your tiled roof pieces are on, you can start to browse the gable pieces, and they are the sloped kind of wall pieces. And you can move those into place to fill those gaps and have it looking nice and finished. I also think it's very important to add the eave pieces to the roof. Having this little bit of overhang just makes it look a lot more realistic. It's the kind of thing you see in the real world, and it adds an extra dimension to the roof. Otherwise it looks a bit too boxy and flat. This bit of overhang just adds something to it. Over on the side of the building where I had the two gables meet, you could see that there was a bit of an overhang in terms of the tiles. They were pointing out the side of the gable, which doesn't look too good. So I decided to mask it with some wooden planks, and once I'd done this, I did kind of think that the rest of this side of the building needed a little bit of decorating along these lines. At the moment it's a bit too flat, it's a bit of an open expanse with nothing really going on. So I added a few different bits of timber in different orientations to try and break it up a little bit and have them be where it would kind of make sense in terms of structure. So it's going to be along areas that need a bit of support, such as this area where the roof transitions into a wall, and around the doors because the lintel's going to need a bit of extra support, and maybe up the centre of the gable as well. It's just a matter of placing a few different bits of timber, seeing what I think looks good, and then kind of going from there. Once I was happy with all the wooden beams, I started to go inside and experiment in there. And as I said earlier, you might want to mask where this roof kind of intersects indoors because it looks a bit weird. So to do that, I just used some standard building pieces that match the walls outside. I used the slopes to match the angle of the roof, and then some of the larger rectangular wall panels. And as we now have this large overhanging area, I decided to get out a wooden beam or post or pillar, that's what it's called, just to kind of suggest a bit of support for this bit of concrete that is just levitating in midair. Again, these little details, these little bits of character really help to just tie your building together. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate in terms of structure, it doesn't need to work 100% accurately, but I think adding these little things does really help with the final look of it. And speaking of things that are being done to make it look a bit more structurally kind of sound but aren't necessary, I also went and made some roof trusses, and they are the wooden structures in the pointy bit of your roof that help support the actual roof rather than just letting it fall in. Now, we don't do anything fancy. I just line up a few different bits of timber and get them at a few different angles, then copy and paste them throughout the building, down the length of the building at regular intervals, just so that it kind of looks like there's something going on in the roof. Because more than anything, you don't have to add this detail, but more than anything, inside it just looks a bit too open. The building has a bit too much space, so I thought adding this little kind of detail would really help to kind of fill it in, but in a non-distracting way. Now, with the basic structure of this habitat house and viewing gallery done, I'm going to start to add our barriers. And something I know that I want is an additional glass barrier running down this side of the habitat, so that the guests can look into the main habitat rather than just where the animals are going to be sleeping. So to begin with, I'm going to be using a glass barrier, and I'm going to adjust my angle to begin with without angle snap. But once I'm happy with it, I'm going to turn the angle snap on so that I can try and keep this as straight a line as possible and keep it really uniform. Normally I like to have quite fluid and curved enclosures, but in this case I'm going to keep it a bit more squared off, have a few more harsh angles and such, and that's because I'm trying to take inspiration from the Chester Zoo design that I've seen. I'm not entirely sure how it's shaped. That's I've never been there in person. It's one of the zoos that's on my zoo bucket list, if you know what I mean. But I've just used reference images best I can, and that mainly influences this viewing gallery here that you can see on screen now. That's going to be viewing the sleeping area for our bears. That is the part of this enclosure that is mainly influenced by Chester Zoo, and so I'm going to be using some null barriers around the building, because obviously that kind of validates it as an actual barrier edge, meaning that the animals will be escaping if they somehow make it through here. So for instance, if they break through this window, which isn't yet in place, then yes, it would actually be an escape. Speaking of the window that's not in place, I'm going to just run a glass barrier through this little portion of the habitat house, just because it's easier than coming back afterwards and placing in a single pane of glass. Then I'm going to switch back to null barrier, continue to outline this building, and then when I get to the back, I'm going to turn to a more sturdy building material, which is going to be the rocks in the mesh, which I can never remember the name of. And then I'm going to just complete the shape of this habitat. And like I said earlier, just like the house, the habitat house, it's just basically going to be a large L, but obviously the habitat itself is going to be bigger than the building. Once the barrier circuit is complete, I just need to make sure the height is appropriate so that the window inside of the viewing gallery is actually filled up with glass, because as it was, there was a little bit of space above it, meaning that something could get over and into the kind of viewing gallery, which would obviously not be ideal. In hindsight, I don't know why I didn't just edit that one piece of barrier. Instead, I made it all taller, which is completely fine because they're going to be bears in here, so they can climb, so it's probably better to have higher barriers anyway. Now, moving on to making sure that guests can actually walk in here. It was a little bit finicky to begin with, but as well, paths always are a bit finicky. So yes, it was going to be that way to begin with, but how I ended up doing it was turning on the grid mode, and to do that on console, when you've got your path up, press in on your right analog stick and you can select a grid. And this grid is normally based on things that you've already built, so it's going to work well with the building that I've put in place. Now I can go over to our selected path. I just want the one that matches the rest of the zoo, and I'm going to turn on the squared feature for the pathing, the square edges, which will enable me to make a large open area inside of this building underneath the floor. It will be invisible so that it appears as the floor we put in place earlier. The guests will walk on top of that, but the path is there underground so that they actually can be utilising this space. Once I fill the whole building, I can start to come out, and I want it to kind of run parallel to our glass viewing gallery outside. Annoyingly, it did come out of the building at a bit of a strange angle. It didn't come out quite as I wanted it to. But this is one of those things where I'm just gonna deal with it, because oftentimes you'll see people thinking everything needs to be perfect, and this is one of those things where I could have made it perfect, but it would have taken a lot of alterations. And you know what? It doesn't need to be perfect. I'm gonna get it to a stage that I think is fine and just leave it, basically. I also decide to link up this path with the Gharial underwater viewing gallery, and then that path I'm going to link up to the path that is right outside of our elephant habitat in front of our snowy dome. This means that there are going to be two ways for our guests and visitors to access this habitat, and that will be by going through the snow dome or this little shopping area right in front of the elephant habitat, and as you can see, it's absolutely heaving. There are loads of people here, so this is a good access point for people to get across to the new part of the zoo. Back over at our habitat house, we're actually going to be starting to make the area where our animals are going to be sleeping, and we're just going to continue to use the dry stone wall pieces for this, matching the aesthetic of the main building. We're going to create a small wall with an archway so the animals can leave, and we're not going to have it be completely flush with the end of the building, just to add a bit more dimension to it. And then once that is in place, I do decide to change the back wall barrier because I don't really like having the bricks at the back, so I'm going to get rid of those, make it into our dry wall pieces, and then use a null barrier just along there so that we can keep it nice and uniform and keep this theme going. Next up, I'm going to pop a glass roof on this part of the habitat house, and that is mainly because I want it to look a little bit different to the main building. I want a lot of natural light in there, and I kind of like the idea of these sun bears being able to sleep in their little house at night while still seeing the stars. This roof is a fairly simple build, just using various glass house roof pieces from the base game. You don't need any DLCs for these because I believe this stuff is used in the very first campaign mission. I think there's a big greenhouse kind of building in that, but it doesn't really matter. You get this as part of the base game. So yeah, I just fill in the roof as you would a normal roof, except it's not as angular, it's a bit smoother, which I also think adds a bit more interest to it as well. Not only having a different building material, but having it being differently orientated in terms of the angles and stuff, I think just breaks it up even more. Once the glass roof is on, I notice that some pieces are clipping through our dry wall pieces, which is very odd and I don't really want that. So I decided to add this clay tiled roof ridge to the top of our wall panels, and not only does it sort out this clipping issue and masks that for us, but it also just helps to add a little bit of differentiation between the wall and the glass. It helps to just add this breaking point where it starts to change materials. I think it just makes it look a lot nicer. Over at our glass viewing gallery, I think it's time that we add a few wooden pillars just over the posts that are in between the panes of glass. I don't really like the stock standard glass posts that are there when you place the barrier down, so I like to mask them with my own materials, and in this case using this massive East Asian unpainted timber pillar. It really helps to kind of blend the glass panels into the theme of the, well, not just the enclosure but the entire zoo. So yeah, I just pop these directly over the top of the posts or panels, well, it is the posts, that are there by default when you place down this barrier. Next up, the weather turned on me and it started to absolutely hammer it down, but I wouldn't let that stop me. I went outside and started to alter the terrain. I wanted to have two risen portions at the back, and to do this I simply used the terrain stamp tool, set it to cube, made it quite wide but relatively low, and then just started to bring up a lot of ground at once. And then we will chip away at it and alter it a bit more in depth in a second, but this was just to give me a basic idea of what I wanted the shape of this enclosure to be, and that was to have two risen areas at the back with a gap in the middle, kind of as if though we are at the tail end of a valley, and using our imagination it could open up into a larger space later on. As always with my habitats, I prefer to have a natural water source, not a pump or a bowl for the animals to drink from. So using the push tool, I make a nice little dip at the front of the habitat, right in front of the glass. The placement wasn't thought about too much, but after actually having the animals in here, I think this is a really good idea because it stops the animals getting right up close to the glass and potentially banging on the glass, because the water is deep enough that they can't really climb out on the other side. So it keeps them at a minimum distance from the glass at all times. Now, one of the main points of influence from the Chester Zoo reference images that I had was that the sleeping area for these bears is going to be largely covered in hay. That's going to be their main kind of floor for sleeping on. And then there are going to be lots of dead trees, lots of half kind of snapped up logs and stuff. The majority are going to be stood up, and then you're going to have a few laying down. So to do this, I used various branches from the African branches in the decorations portion of the construction bit. This isn't going to influence their environmental needs. It's not going to affect their plant coverage or anything. All it's going to do is limit their movement in here, which is fine. There is so much room in the sleeping area. This is plenty of hard shelter, even once I placed all of these branches, which limits it just a little bit. Now, the key to making this look any good is to have variety. We want them to be at different angles, so auto rotate should be on, and we also want different heights. As you can see, this glass roof made it a little bit difficult. On console, it's not quite as easy to zoom in. It's a bit annoying. So yeah, it was just a matter of placing a bunch of these wooden branches randomly, getting them at different heights and different rotations to make it look a bit natural, and then covering the ground in hay. Now back outside, we want to start making the terrain look a little bit more natural, and to do that I'm going to stop the edges of these raised areas being quite so steep. I'm going to use the push tool just to start to kind of level it out a little bit, and then I'll use the smooth tool afterwards to make the transition a bit softer, because at the moment my intensity is at 94% for some reason. I didn't think to turn it down, so all the indents are very, very severe where they could have been a lot softer. So yeah, smoothing it out afterwards will work wonders. And by the time that I'd got the terrain looking a bit tidier, night had started to fall. It was getting to a weird kind of orangey feeling in the sky. Don't know what I'm talking about, whatever. I went and clicked on one of the bears and got up their terrain editor, terrain distribution needs, so that I could go into the terrain editor to start to alter the ground texture. And I had an idea that this little cave area that I'd created, it's not really a cave, it's a very, very shallow, just a tiny bit of covering, because that again is taking inspiration from an image that I found of Chester Zoo. It wasn't a full-on cave by any means, it was the slightest dip in the side of the kind of raised area of ground, and I thought I'd take it upon myself to have a bit of an overhang and make it a bit more of a cavey kind of thing. Like I said, this is not a direct representation of Chester Zoo by any means. I'm just taking aspects from it that I like and trying to implement it into my enclosure design. These guys like quite a bit of short grass, which is obviously nice, as most people in this zoo, same as all the other animals, they just don't like long grass for some reason. So there's not much of that, but there's plenty of soil and a little bit of sand leading from that cavey area to the water, but predominantly it's going to be short grass. In order to mask the back of the raised area of terrain, I'm going to use lots of large boulders and stuff and slightly sinking them down just to bridge that gap between the terrain and the wall. This is an issue, as in the gap is an issue, only because I altered the terrain after adding the barrier. If you make these terrain alterations first, you can then have the barriers placed afterwards and it'll be a much smoother transition. But the way I've done it means I'm going to have to try and blend it out a little bit using various sized rocks. And I like doing this anyway because adding rocks adds a lot of texture to the habitat, makes it look a lot more interesting, especially as you can start to add variation in height as well. It was at this point that I decided to change the wall barrier kind of building material, because I wasn't overly fond of this rocky exterior. I think it kind of contrasted a bit too much against what was going on inside of the habitat. So I decided to turn it to our wooden log barrier. Gonna adjust the height just a little bit more, make it a little bit taller, and I'm also going to add a anti-climb barrier to the top of the back and side of this habitat, because we don't really want these bears being able to climb out. I'm keeping these a bit taller and non-climbable around the perimeter of the habitat, but not going to be adjusting the glass barrier at the front, because they ain't going to be able to climb over that. That's completely fine. And now it's time for my favourite part of any habitat build, and that is the plant coverage. For a change, I decided to go with a lot of kind of muted colours, at least in my eyes. I am actually colourblind, so if these greens are super vibrant, I can't necessarily tell. But what I did know is that I wanted to have a lot more greens opposed to our bright blues and purples that we get from some of the flowers. I wanted to concentrate more on these earthy tones like green and brown and have it look like a kind of old wood or forest. So I'm using a lot of short grass in this. In this case, it's Drin grass because that is the Asian grass coverage we can use. I'm going to do a few different patches of those, sinking it into the ground a little bit here and there just to make sure it doesn't look too long. I'm going to concentrate on patches rather than just all over the habitat because I think breaking it up like that works a lot better than blanketing it across. The next sort of plants I'm going to be using are more green and large plants. We'll stick it to green like I just said. We're going to be using things like ferns and brambles. We want just muted colours. That's all we're after. Keep it kind of cohesive and looking nice and green, which I think is going to help having such a unified colour scheme across the habitat, and then having such a black, dark bear in here is really going to help contrast against the animal is going to contrast against its habitat, which I think is going to look really nice. It's at this stage that I decide to add the Japanese maple tree, and this is going to be our main source of colour, the main thing that isn't going to be green or brown, because I could be wrong, but I think this is an orangey, pinky kind of colour, which I think it looks really nice on top of these hills. I'm placing them mainly on top of the hills because that's the area that's going to be getting the most sunlight throughout most of the day, so plants are going to grow a little bit better up there. Although, I guess plants would grow a little bit better down at the bottom of the hills as well, because water would be gathering down there as well, keeping the soil more moist, and therefore the plants able to feed a little easier. So I'm not entirely sure where is the best place to have the thickest coverage, because both of those sound right in my head. Yeah, I'm rambling again. We're going to move back over to the ground plants like nettles and stuff, and we're just going to cover the ground in this kind of thing. I'm going to leave you to watch a time lapse for this right now. I'm also going to plop in a few dead trees and more of the wooden branches that we were using inside the habitat. Again, I really want this to look like an old and aged wood or forest, so a lot of dead and broken trees is going to work really well. Once I'm happy with how the habitat's looking for the animal, it's time to make this a bit of a better experience for our guests. And one thing that I'm going to need to do is place some education boards either side of this viewing gallery. I'm going to place them on the wall, and in terms of where I'm going to have our energy coming from, because at the moment there's no electricity to this building, we're going to have it be placed just behind this habitat building, out of sight of guests and only accessible by our staff. When placing items like this on a wall, it's always useful to use a line to surface, because otherwise it could just be kind of perpendicular to the wall, which is very annoying. I need to turn off random rotation for items like this, because having them be placed at this weird angle is very, very annoying. I have to adjust it by hand afterwards, but you know, it's a learning curve. We all need to figure these things out, don't we? So once I've got these in place, it's time to move on to a few different education things for this building. But, of course, not before we add enrichment items for our animal. I had completely forgotten that these guys are going to need to be fed and to enjoy themselves. They've got a lovely looking habitat, but they, at the moment, will just die because they're not going to be fed. So I need to add their food tray and various bits of enrichment. As always, I'm going to try and keep the food enrichment in an area that the guests will be able to see nice and easily, and then have the toys and stuff a lot more sporadic, a lot more spread out across the habitat, so that we're making sure our bears are using as much of the habitat as possible. Back inside, due to how much space there is in here, so much empty kind of wasted space, I decided to add a couple exhibits. And to decorate them, I'm going to use these small wooden log panels that you can find by just kind of selecting things, well, using the filters to set it all to wood, and then looking in the building materials, you will find nice small wooden structures that you can then use to line the bottom of your exhibits. I think it's a really simple and effective way of making these look a bit more immersive. If you don't want to be using any blueprints, or you don't want it to look quite as dull as it does by itself, it's a really nice way of just elevating how it looks really, really simply. Just going to outline the base of this and then duplicate it and lift it up so that we can have the exact same thing at the top of the exhibit as well. We also have the opportunity to allow our guests to have a bit of food and drink here. We're not going to be adding any proper shops, but we can add vending machines. This is a perfect location for that kind of thing because it's small and can just be put in a corner. We are a fairly decent kind of length or distance, that's the word. We're a fairly decent distance from the closest shops and stuff at this point, so having these food and drink vending machines will really help to adjust or maintain our guest happiness. I'm also going to add a few conservation boards to this room to boost our education kind of percentage across the entire zoo, but also just as decoration. I think these things make the room look a lot more alive. You've got loads of different bits of colour going on, there are different shapes and stuff, and it's something else for our guests to look at so that they're not all bottlenecking around the habitat viewing gallery or around the exhibits that we're going to be placing. By the way, to place that exhibit, I needed to delete a panel of the path that was underneath the flooring that we laid earlier, but because it was on a grid, it worked really nicely as the grid pieces are the same size as these exhibits. So once you delete one grid piece, the exhibit can be placed directly in that area. Something else that I've been doing in the habitat houses in this zoo is adding a webcam, which you can see right now. I like to angle it down a little bit so that it is actually kind of facing where the animals would be, rather than just looking at, well, at this height it would just be looking at the opposite roof, which would be really boring. This will allow our guests, or people at home more accurately, to look into the habitat house and where our bears are going to be sleeping at night. This actually helps to improve your marketing rating. So by doing this in various habitats, you're going to be increasing that, meaning that you don't have to be paying for marketing through newspaper ads or TV ads or something like that. You can just kind of let it do it more organically. Whilst flicking through the decorations, I found this lovely wooden bear statue that I'm going to use at both exit and entrance of our habitat house. Because I haven't used this bear statue before, I think it looked really nice in the sun bear habitat. Next up, in order to make this viewing gallery look a bit more immersive, I'm going to sink some New World sculpture leaves into the ground. I'm going to use all the different sizes at various heights and different rotations. When I say rotations, it's going to be one way or the other because we want them to be flat against the wall. And this will just help to create a very immersive kind of experience around this habitat viewing gallery. It's not much, it's very clearly fake. We're not trying to trick these people into thinking they are actually in the jungle. That would be pretty silly. But it really does help make this look a lot nicer. I think it feels very much like a real zoo doing this kind of thing, because it's the kind of thing you do see at zoos. So I'm quite happy with this little addition. It's at this point that I realised that there was no lighting in this building, so when it actually does come to night time, it is very, very dark. So I placed some lanterns hanging off some of the wooden beams in the roof. I'm not using many, I think I use 4 in total. It just adds a little bit of light to this building when it's dark, and also it adds a little bit of character having this, one, a different colour. We don't really have any red in this building, so it's quite nice to have that in there. And 2, just a different, I don't know, it's just a different element, isn't it? It looks nice. For our exhibit, I go for the green iguana, mainly because I love iguanas. I think they are beautiful reptiles, but also because we actually do have some other exhibits in the zoo. It wasn't included in a video, but I do have a small education centre in this zoo, and that has some exhibits in it. So we do have some animals elsewhere in the zoo, which are all of our Asian animals. So we're going to have to try and deviate from that now, which is a little unfortunate, but you know, it's something we need to do. Going to make sure that our vets are researching the animal so that we can get all of the props and stuff for inside of its habitat to boost its welfare. Obviously we need to get temperature and humidity to the correct percentage, but we need to have kind of environmental props as well to boost their welfare. Shortly after this, I did feel that it was a bit too open inside here still, so I added a second exhibit animal, and that was the fire salamander. It is a slightly different layout inside of their exhibit. Not by much, but once you've added the environmental enrichment pieces, it does look a bit different, so that's alright. I think just filling this space really helps to make this entire habitat building look so much better. As a finishing touch for this indoor area, I'm going to place some of the child-friendly education things, such as this massive paw print, and these, I think it's actually a soundboard, that paw print. We're also going to be using the other soundboard, which is a lion's mouth, and the gorilla size chart. At this stage I did think the habitat was done, but I decided to make a last minute adjustment, and that is the broken trees and branches that we have inside this habitat are all very similar. So what I thought of, which I hadn't thought of earlier, was to go into the climbing bases in the enrichment items, and there are some natural logs. We can use those as well for a bit of variety instead of them all looking exactly the same. So I'm going to place a few of these climbable natural branches and logs and delete some of the other branches that we added earlier, just to add a little bit of variety to this habitat. And with that small adjustment, we really are done. Thank you so much for watching this penultimate episode of our Little Asia Zoo in franchise mode. If you want to see what's coming next on the channel, make sure you subscribe. It's going to start putting the videos in your subscription feed, and after all it is kind of free, so it doesn't really matter. You can unsubscribe at any point. In terms of the next zoo that I'm going to be working on, there's no set idea yet. It is going to be a bit more broad, things from all around the world though. So make sure that you drop your ideas and suggestions in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Zina